Thank you to the organisers for this opportunity to put a piece before you before the panel discussion, and I hope we can have a lively discussion afterwards. So today I'm going to present some insights from colleagues on understanding the gap between the potential and attainable abatement opportunities that we can create using agriculture and land systems in Australia. And I want to help us to understand what it means for adoption and what we can do to increase participation rates in abatement activities. So by potential, we mean the magnitude of abatement that is biophysically possible. That's about areas, it's about numbers of emitting activities, it's about technologies that exist and practices that are used. When I refer to attainable, or you might say realisable, I'm talking about what we could reasonably expect to see in practice given concerted efforts to get adoption. That's really about people, the institutional arrangements we make, and particularly about the land and technologies and people in combination. A lot of effort so far is focused on defining the magnitude of abatement opportunity rather than understanding the pathway to achieving that abatement through the use of our land or agricultural practices. Along the way, I think there's probably been a lot of confusion and perhaps some mischief played. The focus to date has been constructive in helping Australia figure out what a pathway to reducing emissions might be. The focus of our conversation now really needs to move forward to how we might achieve that abatement. I think a vital framing concept, and I think it's one that Ben's going to visit shortly afterwards, is understanding what it means in practice to take both a top-down and bottom-up view of abatement. I suppose it's not unreasonable, though perhaps naive, to think that there's a common view from both directions around aspiring for a vibrant, viable rural community across the triple bottom line. From the top down, carbon abatement policy clearly seeks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by structuring patterns of natural resource use and management. It does that within the milieu of a whole range of other policy around regional management, regional development, food and energy security, our international relations, and a broader concept of national welfare. And from that perspective, that can be thought of as carbon with co-benefits. That is, how can we have abatement and in the process of doing so derive other benefits for the nation? From the bottom up, and especially with agriculture as a non-covered sector, it is the motivations of land managers and their various aspirations, skills and constraints that will ultimately create abatement. Notwithstanding the surveys that show landholders are deeply concerned about climate change and in fact would like to see more action on climate change, it is likely that they will be acting to create a range of benefits which then result in carbon abatement rather than the other way around. For example, it might be a cattle producer seeking to improve production by turning off cattle sooner and in doing so achieving methane emissions reduction. Understanding these different perspectives is particularly important when Australian agriculture is not a covered sector and participation will depend upon things like cooperatively agreed standards of performance. What is additionality? How is leakage defined? The provision of financial incentives to try and drive abatement and trying to get voluntary action through the provision of information and support. So when we take that top-down view, it's clearly about removing those institutional arrangement impediments, creating functioning markets and harmonising policy. And from below, the world is a bit more complex and there's a limitation there around scientific knowledge and how to approach those complex problems of technical and instrumental uncertainty. How do we measure things? What are the consequences played out through land? How does it play out in my situation? I think that's reasonably well discussed and through the Clean Energy Futures and other mechanisms, there's significant investment now directed towards trying to tease out these aspects of technical and instrumental uncertainty. However, we think, colleagues and I, that the role of what we might term ambiguity in acting as an impediment to uptake is often overlooked. And by what we mean, when we talk about ambiguity, we're talking about something different than uncertainty. Uncertainty results from not having enough information on which to make decisions, to set thresholds or decide on the impact locally. Ambiguity, however, is generated when the expected or acceptable patterns of behaviour are unclear or meanings or values are contested. When confronted with uncertainty, we look for evidence, things that define the range of possible futures. When dealing with ambiguity, we look for precedent and tradition, consensus within our community, where our values are anchored. Ambiguity can be confused with uncertainty. In this way, interpretations of fairness, responsibility, can be misdiagnosed as an information deficit that could easily be remedied through technical data, rather than the appropriate solution, which is understanding and aligning conflicting or shifting goals, understanding capacity limitations or differences in interest. For example, we often hear a landholder will say he farms land and does not grow trees, or feels ultimately a stronger affinity with leaving more farming options and flexibility for his children than worrying about intergenerational climate change equity. In these cases, information about the economic benefits of trees are not going to be helpful in the dialogue. At a national level, this sort of ambiguity might be evidenced through the sort of mixed dialogue we have around food security and the role of land in contributing to greenhouse gas abatement, about which is the greater moral imperative of our time. Embedded in the current approaches to abatement, there is such an ambiguity, the inclusion of co-benefits into the CFI scheme. Co-benefit generation via CFI is supported through a number of initiatives, the Biodiversity Fund, Indigenous Carbon Fund, as well as the co-benefit specification in the positive and negative lists of the CFI regulations. The effectiveness of these initiatives will require a critical analysis as to how co-benefit metrics are designed and used to evaluate CFI projects and incentive schemes. Successful implementation will require a balancing of carbon with co-benefits and benefits with co-carbon. And that will need to keep true to the primary goal of mitigation, which is to achieve greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Just as an example of what I mean there, mixed species environmental planting sequester less carbon than fast-growing monocultures, at least if you believe what our models say. And so if we want biodiversity, we get less carbon per hectare or per dollar, which is fine, and we may well do that, seeking multiple objectives. But we must be aware of the deep ambiguity inherent in that set of decisions. So in that sort of ambiguous environment where we're entangling carbon with co-benefits in the creation of markets, the creation of markets, reduction in transaction costs, and the generation of models and frameworks will be necessary, but it's not going to be the whole picture. So if we take a simple case of a farmer looking at productivity and carbon trade-offs, where the primary focus is productivity, and the farmer in doing so generates carbon abatement along the way, we can see that, in that case, simply the provision of expert advice in what's a contested area can be constructive. But if we think of a more complex situation, such as livelihoods or biodiversity co-benefits, where there are multiple sources of knowledge, there's Indigenous knowledge, there's a conflicting range of views around what constitutes biodiversity and varying interpretation and valuation, there's different views around the role of land, and there are also a whole range of people with a stake in the outcome, ranging from farmers, industry, government, city folk, country folk, international partners in trade and abatement, then clearly there's a situation here where what's needed is not so much the presentation of information, but the use of information and knowledge to create the opportunity and framework for negotiations amongst these multiple stakeholders to create superior outcomes. The role is simply not better decision support tools, but the use of decision support tools and knowledge to allow for better decisions. I think the process that's been underway in the formation of the Indigenous co-benefit criteria is one excellent example of the creation of such a negotiation space based on the contribution of a wide range of knowledge sources to identify aspects that need to be included within the decision process rather than the direction around how the decision should be made.